History records the dissolution of empires through the thunder of artillery and the marching of armies, yet the most lethal fractures often originate in absolute, suffocating silence. Within the hyper-regulated ecosystem of the imperial court, survival is not a matter of physical evasion, but of calculated biomechanical endurance. Consider the collar of the traditional Qing dynasty consort robe. To the untrained eye, the 3 layers of densely woven silk, stiffened with organic starches and fastened tightly against the throat with intricate frog closures, represent the pinnacle of modesty and elite aesthetic. Forensically, it functions as a gilded garrote. It is a brilliant mechanism of behavioral control designed to subtly restrict the intake of oxygen, press against the carotid artery, and dictate the very posture of the wearer. Every breath must be shallow. Every turn of the head requires a deliberate, strained pivoting of the entire torso. When a woman reaches the psychological breaking point in this environment, the initial act of rebellion is profoundly microscopic. It is the mechanical, metallic snick of sharp tailoring scissors severing those ancient, tightly wound silk knots. That single severance, performed in the dead of night, releases a flood of stolen oxygen into bruised, constricted lungs. It is the necessary biological preamble to a far more violent act. What follows is not the drawing of a blade, but the dry, abrasive scratching of a Western fountain pen carving industrial black ink into the fibrous, machine-milled paper of a modern legal decree. This is not a domestic dispute. It is the clinical, forensic assassination of 3,000 years of dynastic law. To understand the absolute necessity of this treason, one must analyze the geometry of the gilded cage itself. The consort's inner chamber is ostensibly a sanctuary, but spatial analysis reveals it to be an elegantly upholstered tomb. The room is aggressively over-furnished, choked by its own staggering opulence. Massive carved mahogany screens and towering shelves loaded with priceless, fragile Qing porcelain dictate the flow of movement, leaving only a painfully narrow, claustrophobic pathway for the inhabitant to pace. These objects are not merely decorative, they are spatial colonizers that consume the breathable volume of the room. The architecture itself is weaponized against the occupant. Heavy brocade curtains seal out the natural world, while the air within becomes visibly dense, saturated with the stale, inescapable particulate matter of burning sandalwood and the trapped, panicked exhalations of a woman who realizes she is buried alive. The atmospheric pressure inside this chamber is designed to crush the individual ego into submission. Against the thick glass of the lattice windows, a relentless, unyielding rain drums, a monotonous, isolating rhythm, serving as an acoustic barrier that traps the consort in a vacuum of silence. There is no open air here, no horizon to focus upon, only the suffocating proximity of extreme, inherited wealth that operates as a physical barricade against the outside world. This environment does not nurture. It slowly asphyxiates. It forces the human mind to fold in upon itself, inducing a profound, localized paranoia where every shadowed corner holds the silent, judging gaze of the ancestral hierarchy waiting to punish the slightest deviation from protocol. The physical restrictions extend far beyond the mahogany furniture and the claustrophobic layout of the chamber. The imperial wardrobe is, in essence, a wearable, highly ornamented prison. The outer robe, intricately embroidered with golden pheasants, using meticulous stitching techniques that render the threads as rigid and unyielding as copper wire, weighs heavily upon the fragile shoulders of the wearer. This is not clothing meant for utility or comfort. It is a ceremonial armor designed to transform a living, breathing woman into a static, decorative artifact of the state. The sheer weight of the silk, densely layered over rigidly starched undergarments, fundamentally alters the wearer's center of gravity and severely limits her biomechanical range of motion. To run is physically impossible. To stride with purpose is heavily impeded by the restrictive cut of the fabric. The garment ensures that the consort can only shuffle, her steps artificially shortened, her physical agency entirely neutralized by the textiles she is forced to bear. This is the true, insidious nature of extreme imperial luxury. It is inextricably linked to the total deprivation of bodily autonomy. The consort exists merely as a captive display of the emperor's boundless authority, her every micro-movement monitored, catalogued, and judged by an invisible network of palace eunuchs and attendants who act as the nervous system of the court. To survive in this panopticon requires a terrifying degree of psychological compartmentalization. One must completely mask the frantic, arrhythmic thudding of a terrified heart beneath the slow, deliberate, and highly controlled physical movements demanded by rigorous court etiquette. This state of constant hypervigilance inevitably breeds a devastating, exhausting acoustic paranoia. In the suffocating, engineered silence of the inner court, sound itself becomes a lethal liability. The heavy, breathless friction of stiff silk dragging against a polished mahogany chair is enough to betray a pacing, restless mind to the listeners outside the door. Every subtle rustle of the garment, every microscopic creak of the floorboards underfoot, is instantaneously processed as a potential alarm that could summon the crushing, fatal weight of imperial discipline. The consort is trapped in a silent, agonizing standoff with her own environment, acutely aware that to attempt any form of escape is to invite complete historical erasure and physical ruin. Yet, remaining in the cage guarantees a slow, agonizing psychological death. The internal debate she wages in the isolated hours before dawn is not merely about leaving an abusive marriage. It is about willingly amputating herself from the only cosmological reality she has ever known. To challenge the Son of Heaven is an unthinkable heresy that defies the fundamental order of the universe as understood by the Empire. She must overcome the sheer, paralyzing gravity of divine imperial law that has been methodically drilled into her psyche since birth. This requires a radical act of cognitive dissonance, a willful shattering of the ancestral programming that demands her absolute, unquestioning subservience. She must look at the priceless jade artifacts surrounding her and recognize them not as divine treasures, but as the intricate bars of her cage, physical artifacts of her own systemic oppression. The instrument of her liberation is violently out of place in this ancient, highly curated setting. Resting upon a centuries-old lacquer-finished desk is a piece of contraband that represents a lethal, unstoppable infiltration of the modern world. An industrial steel fountain pen and a sheaf of machine-milled, standardized legal paper. The contrast between this modern apparatus and the traditional tools of the court is stark, jarring, and fundamentally symbolic of the impending rupture. For millennia, imperial edicts and court documents were drafted using slow-ground pine, soot ink, and soft, yielding wolf-hair brushes instruments that demand immense patience, fluidity, and strict adherence to ancient, rhythmic calligraphy. The Western fountain pen, by contrast, is a rigid mechanical tool of clinical, unfeeling precision. The ink it harbors is not the organic, sepia-toned soot of the ancestors, but a harsh, chemically synthesized liquid designed for absolute permanence, mass production, and speed. As she prepares to write, the chemical reality of this ink mirrors her own psychological state. It is corrosive, unforgiving, and entirely incompatible with the soft, delicate silk of her former life. She is about to introduce a foreign, industrial pathogen into the closed, decaying biological system of the dynastic court. The paper itself, stark white, chemically bleached, and devoid of any imperial watermark, sits upon the dark, aged mahogany like a glowing, undeniable indictment. It is a modern legal document, a standardized civil divorce decree that operates on a jurisdictional frequency entirely alien to the ancient mandate of heaven. The climax of this silent, bloody revolution arrives in the microscopic collision of these two irreconcilable eras. When the sharp, cold glint of the steel nib finally touches the fibrous, textured surface of the modern paper, it is a moment of devastating microviolence. The industrial black ink bleeds immediately into the paper fibers, permanently scarring the page with a forensic reality that cannot be undone, erased, or rationalized by the court's official historians. This is not the elegant, flowing brushstroke of a classical poem, or a submissive plea for imperial favor. It is a slow, agonizingly precise mechanical action that systematically dismantles an empire's claim to absolute authority. The abrasive, tearing scratch of the metal pen echoes loudly in the claustrophobic chamber, a sound so violently mundane and bureaucratic that it completely shatters the sacred, untouchable aura of the imperial space. With every modern letter formed, the suffocating atmosphere seems to visibly rupture, letting in the cold, unforgiving, and radically egalitarian air of the 20th century. The act of signing is an act of sheer, unadulterated forensic sabotage. It does not draw a single drop of physical blood, yet it effectively severs the divine lineage at its absolute core. By applying the modern civil code to the emperor, she forcefully strips him of his mythological, godlike status, dragging the Son of Heaven down into the dirt to face the mundane, humiliating position of a legally bound defendant. The psychological threshold is permanently crossed. The living deity has been successfully mortalized. In the immediate aftermath of this bloodless execution, the physical shedding of the imperial identity becomes a mandatory biological imperative. The consort slips her shoulders out of the heavy, golden-embroidered outer robe, letting it collapse to the mahogany floor like the discarded, suffocating skin of a gilded serpent. Without its immense restrictive weight pressing down upon her ribcage, her breathing instantly changes, becoming deeper, ragged, and undeniably, vibrantly human. She abandons the inner chamber without a backward glance, leaving behind the priceless antiques, the choking sandalwood incense, and the centuries of accumulated, blood-soaked wealth as nothing more than worthless historical debris. On the dark mahogany desk, illuminated only by the faint, creeping pre-dawn light, the newly signed document rests completely alone. Within this razor-sharp two-dimensional reality, the decree stands as a lethal, fully loaded weapon left in plain sight for the eunuchs to discover. It represents a permanent, unhealable fracture in the mandate of heaven, achieved without the deployment of a single soldier, executed entirely through the calculated, forensic application of modern jurisprudence against ancient, rotting dogma. The historical echo of this event is laced with a bitter, profound philosophical irony. The Qing dynasty expended incalculable human and financial resources constructing impenetrable physical walls and elaborately cruel behavioral codes to protect the emperor from external threats, only to be utterly dismantled from within the most secure, deeply intimate sector of the palace. The ultimate act of survival for this marginalized woman required her to weaponize her own erasure, proving to history that the true apex of power does not lie in the occupation of the dragon throne, but in the terrifying, unprecedented willingness to simply walk away from it, leaving the dying empire to suffocate inside its own gilded cage.